The air inside Moore's Traditions was thick, smelling of scorched sugar and the yeasty warmth of a business fighting for its last breath. Joon-seok stood by the worn wooden counter, the clinical sharpness of his charcoal business suit clashing violently with the cracked floor tiles and the humble hum of an aging refrigerator. In his hand, he gripped a leather folder containing the final foreclosure notice, a neatly contained transaction that would clear the way for a new glass and steel high-rise. He had closed billion-dollar deals without flinching, yet as he prepared to deliver the killing blow to this small neighborhood fixture, the folder felt heavier than any contract he had ever authorized. He had chosen this specific bakery for acquisition precisely because it was a minor asset, a forgotten corner of the city that his company, Global Insight, could absorb without a whisper of public notice. He was the man whose face graced every financial news cycle, the ruthless architect of carefully constructed success. Today was supposed to be simple: finalize the paperwork, erase the debt, and move on. But when Joon-seok raised his eyes from the legal document, the world beneath his polished Oxford shifted. Behind the counter stood Joann, the woman he had buried under years of global expansions and sterile corporate victories. She was the only person who had ever truly seen him before he became someone worth fearing. The art student who had once challenged his serious expressions with laughter. Now, her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, escaping in curly wisps around a face that looked drawn and exhausted. A smudge of white flour was stark against her cheek, but it wasn't the flour that made his heart contract with a sudden, brittle fear. Joann was visibly, unmistakably 8 months pregnant. She stood with her hands resting protectively over the heavy curve of her belly, her floral dress stretched tight beneath a stained apron. The air between them crystallized, turning cold and dangerous as recognition dawned in her eyes. First came the shock, then a look of something far harder to define, a steel-edged guard he hadn't known she possessed. "Welcome to Moore's Traditions," she said, her voice formal and practiced, the kind of tone reserved for a stranger or a debt collector. "How can I help you today?" Joon-seok tried to respond, but the voice that commanded boardrooms across Asia had utterly abandoned him. He looked at the flower on her cheek and then down at the foreclosure papers in his hand. He was the creditor. He was the man who had personally signed the orders to dismantle her family's legacy while she was carrying a life he knew nothing about. "Joon-seok," she whispered, her mask slipping for a fleeting second. "Joann," he finally managed, his gaze dropping back to her belly. "I think we need to talk about more than just the rent." The silence that followed Joann's name was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the hum of the industrial ovens and the distant, muffled laughter of the bakery staff who had no idea their world was about to end. Joon-seok felt the leather folder in his hand grow slick with the sudden sweat of his palms. He was a man who lived by the clock, by the second, by the closing bell of the stock exchange. Yet in this moment, time had stopped being a linear progression. It had become a suffocating pool, trapping him in the reflection of the woman standing across the counter. Joann didn't move. She stood framed by shelves of cooling sourdough and golden brioche, the rustic warmth of the bakery serving as a cruel backdrop to her exhaustion. The smudge of flour on her cheek seemed to highlight the dark circles beneath her eyes, but Joon-seok's focus was anchored lower. His gaze was fixed on the unmistakable silhouette beneath her apron. He had spent the last few years calculating risk, projecting growth, and measuring the distance between himself and his competitors, but he couldn't calculate the weight of the 8 months he had missed. He looked at her hands, those hands that used to smell of turpentine and oil paint, now resting protectively over the curve of her stomach. The knuckles were pale, her fingers interlaced as if shielding the life within from the man holding the foreclosure notice. A tremor started in his chest, a low, vibrating dissonance that threatened to crack the polished veneer of his corporate persona. He had come here to finalize a neatly contained acquisition, a minor asset to be absorbed into his empire. He had expected to see a landlord, perhaps a desperate manager, but not the woman he had buried under years of global expansions and sterile victories. "Joon-seok," she repeated, her voice stronger this time, though it carried a jagged edge of weariness. "You shouldn't be here." "I didn't know," he managed to say, the words feeling like broken glass in his throat. He wasn't talking about the bakery or the debt. He was talking about the life she was carrying, a life that shared his bloodline and his history. He took a half step forward, his expensive Oxfords crunching softly on a stray grain of sugar on the floor. The sound was deafening in the stillness. Joann instinctively leaned back, her hip brushing against a tray of cooling loaves. The movement was defensive, a sharp reminder that to her, he wasn't the man who had shared her dreams on napkins in a rainy tea house. He was the billionaire boss who had sent a team of lawyers to take the only thing she had left. The irony of the situation began to settle into his bones like a deep, persistent cold. He had built Global Insight to be a fortress, a machine designed to eliminate inefficiency and maximize value. He had trained himself to see people as assets or liabilities. And now, he was standing face to face with the ultimate liability, a debt-ridden legacy and a child he had never claimed, both of which were being crushed by the very machine he operated. Behind the counter, a young assistant glanced at them, her brow furrowing at the intense silence between the man in the dark suit and her pregnant boss. "Joann, is everything okay?" the girl asked, her voice cautious. Joann didn't look away from Joon-seok. She didn't blink. "It's fine, Minji. Just an old acquaintance checking on the lease." Old acquaintance. The phrase was a physical blow. It was a clinical erasure of the nights they had spent planning a future that didn't involve boardrooms or foreclosure notices. It was the sound of a door being locked from the inside. Joon-seok looked down at the leather folder, the legal document visible through the clear plastic sleeve. The signature line was empty, waiting for his authority to finalize the destruction of Moore's traditions. He felt the weight of his carefully constructed success pressing down on him, a mountain of gold and steel that suddenly felt hollow. He had everything: the penthouse, the influence, the name, and yet, as he looked at Joann and the life she held so closely, he realized he was the one who was truly bankrupt. "The debt," he started, his voice barely a whisper, "it's to Global Insight. To me." Joann's eyes flashed with a sudden, searing spark of resentment. "I know exactly who owns my misery, Joon-seok. I've known since the first notice arrived 6 months ago. Did you come here to watch the lights go out in person, or did you just want to see if there was anything left to take?" Joon-seok stood frozen, the man who moved the world reduced to a silent witness to his own cruelty. He looked at the flower on her cheek, the curve of her belly, and the empty space where his heart used to be, and for the first time in a decade, he didn't know the next move. The smell of burnt sugar and cheap yeast in the bakery acted as a bridge, dragging Joon-seok's consciousness backward through a tunnel of years to a kitchen that had smelled exactly the same, but for a different reason. Before the penthouse in Gangnam, before the fleet of black sedans and the silent assistants, there had been the apartment in Mapogu. It was a space so small that if Joann was painting at her easel, Joon-seok had to climb over the bed just to reach the refrigerator. It was a Tuesday night in early spring, a night that remained etched in his mind with the clarity of a diamond. He had come home later than usual, his cheap off-the-rack suit damp from the Seoul rain, but his eyes were wide with a manic, terrifying light. He had carried a green glass bottle under his arm like a precious relic. It was a bottle of champagne that cost more than their monthly grocery budget, a reckless, beautiful extravagance they absolutely could not afford. "Joon-seok, what is that?" Joann had asked, wiping a streak of cobalt blue paint across her forehead as she looked up from her canvas. "It's the beginning," he had whispered, his voice trembling. "The venture firm, they signed the term sheet. The first round of funding is ours." In that cramped kitchen, with the linoleum peeling at the corners and the radiator clanking like a dying machine, they hadn't felt poor. They had felt like giants. Joann had laughed, a bright, melodic sound that filled every empty crack of that tiny apartment, and she hadn't chided him for the cost of the bottle. Instead, she had cleared a space on the cluttered dining table, pushing aside her sketches and his spreadsheets to make room for 2 mismatched juice glasses. The cork had popped with a celebratory thud, and the foam had spilled over his fingers, fingers that hadn't yet learned how to sign away people's lives. They sat on the floor because the chairs were piled high with Joann's canvases. They drank the expensive bubbles out of those thick glass cups and ate cold kimbap, dreaming of a future where they would never have to check their bank balance again. Everything changes now, he had promised her, lifting his glass. I'm going to build a world where you never have to worry. I'm going to give you the gallery you've always wanted. I'm going to make sure we never have to choose between the rent and the dream. Joann had leaned her head on his shoulder, her hair smelling of linseed oil and the cheap soap they shared. I don't need a gallery, Joon-seok, she had replied softly. I just need you to come home. Don't get lost in the building of the world that you forget to live in it. He had squeezed her hand then, promising her the moon and the stars, truly believing that success was a destination they would reach together. He didn't know then that success was not a place, but a predator, one that would slowly consume his time, then his attention, and finally, his ability to see the woman sitting right in front of him. He didn't know that the one more meeting or one more milestone would become a wall, brick by brick, until he was on one side with his billions and she was on the other with her heart in pieces. Now, standing in the cold light of the debt-ridden bakery, the ghost of that champagne felt like ash on his tongue. He looked at Joann, not the art student with paint on her brow, but the woman holding her stomach in a failing shop, and realized that the future he had promised her in that kitchen was the very thing currently crushing her to death. He had kept his promise to change the world. He had just forgotten to save a place for her in it. The memory of the champagne bubbles and the peeling linoleum faded, replaced by the harsh, fluorescent reality of the bakery and the heavy, accusing silence of the woman standing before him. The ghost of his younger, hopeful self vanished, leaving only the billionaire CEO, the man who had perfected the art of the acquisition. Joon-seok's fingers tightened on the leather folder, the material smooth and cold against his skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the oven-heated air. He looked down at the document tucked into the plastic sleeve, really looking at it for the first time. At the top of the page, embossed in a subtle, authoritative font, was the logo of GI Capital, a subsidiary of his own Global Insight Holdings. Beneath it was the case number and the legal designation of the property. He had reviewed a list of distressed assets just 3 weeks ago in his high-rise office, a list that contained dozens of small businesses that were no longer viable in the current economy. He had initialed the bottom of the summary page with a gold fountain pen, a 5-second gesture that had set this entire machine in motion. To him, it had been an exercise in efficiency, a way to clear the books of underperforming debt to make room for a luxury development project. To the computer algorithms his firm used, Moore's Traditions was simply a series of red numbers on a spreadsheet. It didn't mention the flour-stained apron, the history of the neighborhood, or the woman who was 8 months pregnant and fighting for a legacy that stretched back generations. "You're the lead creditor," Joann said, her voice cutting through his internal haze. It wasn't a question. She watched him with a clinical detachment that mirrored his own corporate style, and the realization that she had adapted his own coldness as a shield against him felt like a physical blow. "Your firm bought the original mortgage from the local bank 4 months ago. Then you raised the interest rates. Then you refused the restructuring plan." Joon-seok felt a wave of nausea. He hadn't known the specific name of the bakery, but he knew the strategy. It was a standard squeeze play his executives used to force a quick liquidation. He had praised the department for their aggressive optimization during the last quarterly meeting. He had toasted to their record profits with the same hand that was now shaking as it held the notice of her ruin. "Joann, I signed thousands of these," he stammered, the excuse sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "I don't see the names. I don't see the faces. It's handled by the Assets Management Division." "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" She stepped closer to the counter, the light catching the steel in her eyes. "You've built a world where you don't have to see anything you destroy. You've automated your conscience, Joon-seok. You sit in your glass tower and sign away people's lives because they're just underperforming assets to you. But this asset is my home. It's where my father worked until he died. It's where I was going to bring my child." She placed a hand on her stomach. a gesture that was both protective and a silent accusation. Joon-seok looked at the folder in his hand, then at the smudge of flour on her cheek. He realized that the wealth he had accumulated, the billions that made him one of the most powerful men in Asia, was effectively the ransom for her future. Every zero on his bank statement had come at the cost of people like her, people who lived, without permission, in the corners of the city his machines were erasing. He thought of his assistant, waiting in the black sedan outside with a tablet and a schedule that didn't allow for a 10-minute delay. He thought of the board of directors who expected him to deliver the deed to this property by the end of the day. For the first time in his career, the expectations of his empire felt like a collar. He wasn't just the man who had closed the deal. He was the man who had become a stranger to himself. The realization settled in his chest, heavy and immovable. He wasn't here to finalize a transaction. He was here to witness the final consequence of the choice he had made 12 years ago, the choice to value the climb more than the person he was climbing for. He looked at Joann, really saw her, and realized that he was the villain in a story he thought he was the hero of. He was the creditor, and the debt he owed her was something that could never be settled with a check. The transition from the small Mapogu apartment to their larger, Gangnam residence had happened so quickly that Joon-seok barely remembered the move itself. He only remembered the silence that began to settle into the new, high-ceilinged rooms, a silence that grew deeper with every international office he opened. The 18-hour day didn't arrive all at once. It crept into their lives like a slow-moving tide, eventually submerging the morning coffee and the late-night laughter they had once shared. As Global Insight's international expansion accelerated, Joon-seok's life became a blur of time zones and logistics. He started leaving the apartment at 5 in the morning, the blue-gray light of dawn reflecting off the cold marble of their foyer, while Joann was still a soft, breathing shadow beneath the sheets. By the time he returned, often past midnight, the only sign of her presence was a single lamp left burning in the living room and a plate of food wrapped in plastic on the kitchen island. The meals were always thoughtful, experimental recipes she had once been excited to share, but by the time he sat down to eat them, they were cold, the flavors muted by hours of waiting. Their conversations, once vibrant and filled with artistic debates and shared dreams, were whittled down to mere logistics. "I have a flight to Singapore at 6, he would say into his phone while adjusting his tie. "I'll try to be back for the gallery opening on Friday," he would promise, knowing even as the words left his lips that a meeting in Tokyo or a negotiation in Hong Kong would inevitably intervene. The goalposts of his ambition were constantly moving. There was always one more funding round, one more milestone, one more market to dominate. He told himself it was temporary. He whispered, just until, like a mantra, just until the IPO, just until the expansion was stable, just until he could provide the life she deserved. But the life she deserved was being traded, hour by hour, for the life he wanted. Joann tried to bridge the gap at first. She attended the mandatory company functions where wives were expected to be decorative and undemanding, standing silently by his side while he discussed market penetration and profit margins with men who checked their watches every few minutes. He watched her transformation from the arts student with paint-stained fingers to the sophisticated CEO's wife, dressed in tailored silk and muted tones. She stopped talking about her own canvases, her dreams of opening a gallery quietly deferred and then forgotten, replaced by the crushing weight of being a woman who waited. The Korean business world operated by its own ruthless rules, and Joon-seok had learned to play by them with a frightening efficiency. Hierarchy and sacrifice were the currency of his success. He learned to drink with clients until the early hours, to place business relationships above personal ones, and to view his own home as little more than a satellite office where he slept for a few hours between appointments. He didn't notice that the spare room, which was supposed to be her studio, remained empty, the easel he had bought her standing like a skeletal remains of a life they had abandoned. He had become a man who was physically present but emotionally absent, a ghost haunting the corners of his own marriage. He didn't see the way Joann looked at him when he finally did come home, not with anger, but with a profound, weary sadness, as if she were mourning someone who was still standing in the room. He didn't notice the missing books or the empty spaces on the shelves where her small treasures had once stood. He was too busy building an empire to notice that the foundation of his world was being packed into boxes. By the time the international expansion was a resounding success, Joon-seok was a name whispered in awe across the financial districts of Asia. He had achieved everything he had set out to do. He had the wealth, the power, and the carefully constructed success he had dreamed of in that Mapogu kitchen. But when he finally stopped running to look around, he found himself standing in a perfectly appointed, silent apartment, holding a key to a home that was no longer his. He had built a world for a wife who had finally stopped waiting for a husband who never returned. The analytical mind of Joon-seok was a precision instrument, a machine refined by decades of high-stakes negotiations and complex financial modeling. Even in the midst of a personal earthquake, that part of his brain, the cold, calculating processor, began to run the numbers without his permission. It was an old reflex, the due diligence of a man who never accepted a story without verifying the timeline. He stood paralyzed behind the bakery counter, his gaze surreptitiously tracing the curve of Joann's silhouette, while his mind began a silent, frantic countdown. 8 months. She had said it with a defiance that brooked no argument, but the number itself became a focal point for his internal machinery. He worked backward from the current winter chill, past the autumn leaves and the humid heat of late summer, landing squarely in the late spring. May. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, more violent than any corporate raid. May was the month the foundation of his world had finally crumbled into dust. It was the month of the final board meeting for the Singapore expansion, a time when he had been so consumed by the logistics of global dominance that he had become a stranger in his own hallway. But beneath the layers of business calls and late-night flights, there was one memory that remained vivid, buried under the debris of their divorce. It had been a Thursday night, a rare evening when he had returned home before the city fell silent. The silence in their Gangnam apartment had been brittle, the air thick with the unspoken words of a marriage that had already begun to breathe its last. Joann had been standing by the window, looking out at the Han River, her shoulders tight with a weariness that no amount of luxury could soothe. They had fought, not with raised voices, but with the cold, sharp precision of two people who knew exactly where the other's armor was thinnest. And then, in a moment of desperate, hollow longing, they had tried to find the people they used to be in the dark of their bedroom. It was a final, silent attempt to bridge a gap that had become an abyss, a brief flare of the old fire before the cold took over for good. 3 weeks later, he had found the apartment half empty, her paintings gone, and a note on the table that felt like a death certificate. He had signed the divorce papers in June, convinced that they were simply two assets that no longer yielded a return. He had moved to a penthouse that overlooked the city like a watchtower, never once looking back to see what might have been growing in the wreckage he left behind. 8 months, he whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the bakery's cooling fans. He wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking to the ghost of the man he had been in May. The math was undeniable. The life she was carrying was a legacy he had unknowingly discarded, a dividend of their final, tragic attempt at connection. As he looked at Joann now, her hands resting protectively over the child, her eyes filled with a steel-edged guard, the folder in his hand felt like a lead weight. He wasn't just the lead creditor of a failing bakery. He was the man who had walked away from his own flesh and blood because he was too busy looking at a spreadsheet to notice a miracle. The irony was a bitter poison. He had spent his life building a name that would last, an empire that would stand as a monument to his existence. He had obsessed over succession plans and heritage, all while the only true legacy that mattered was being nourished in a debt-ridden shop he was currently trying to destroy. Every zero on his bank balance, every floor of his office tower, seemed to shrink in significance compared to the heartbeat he had missed. Joann saw the change in his expression, the way the corporate mask finally shattered to reveal a raw, jagged grief. She didn't offer him comfort. She didn't offer him a way out. She simply stood her ground, A mother protecting her child from the man who had prioritized the world over them. "You did the math, didn't you, Joon-seok?" she asked, her voice quiet but lethal. "You couldn't help yourself. You always were better at numbers than people." He looked at her, then at the smudge of flour on her cheek, and finally at the life beneath her apron. For the first time in his life, Han Joon-seok, the man with all the answers, found himself standing in the middle of a transaction where he was the one who was utterly, hopelessly bankrupt. He had the money to save the bakery, but he realized with a terrifying clarity that he didn't yet have the soul to earn the right to be there. Joann reached out and touched the scarred surface of the wooden counter, her fingers tracing a deep groove in the grain, as if seeking an anchor in the storm of Joon-seok's presence. The defiance in her eyes hadn't vanished, but it had softened into a bone-deep weariness that no amount of Billionaire's regret could easily soothe. She looked past him, through the glass storefront where the city continued to churn, indifferent to the shattering of a man's corporate ego. "I didn't leave because I wanted a different kind of wealth, Joon-seok," she began, her voice low and steady, stripped of the jagged anger from moments before. "I left because I was drowning in yours. When I walked out of that apartment in June, I didn't take the settlement. I didn't touch the trust fund your lawyers set up. I knew that if I took even a single cent of your billions, I would never truly be free of the man who thought everything, even love, was an asset to be managed." Joon-seok felt the air in his lungs turn to lead. He remembered the reports from his legal team, the confusion when the wire transfers remained unaccepted, the way they had eventually assumed she was playing a long game for a larger payout. He had let them believe it because it fit his worldview. It was easier to think she was greedy than to admit she found his money repulsive. "I came back here, to my father's shop," she continued, gesturing to the shelves of cooling bread. "This place was debt-ridden long before you bought the mortgage. My father was a baker, not a businessman. He gave away more than he sold, and when he died, he left me a legacy of flour and red ink. But it was real. Every loaf I baked in those first few months was a struggle for stability. I worked 20-hour shifts, my back aching and my hands raw, just to keep the lights on for one more day. I lived in the studio upstairs, sleeping on a cot surrounded by sacks of grain, because I couldn't afford the rent on an actual apartment." She paused, her hand moving instinctively to the heavy curve of her belly. "And then I realized I wasn't just working for myself anymore. When the morning sickness started, when the fatigue became something I couldn't just drink coffee to ignore, the bakery became more than a shop. It became a fortress. I stayed here, I fought the banks, and I ignored the foreclosure threats because I wanted this child to know what it meant to build something with your own hands, something that didn't require a board of directors or a hostile takeover to exist." Joon-seok looked at the smudge of flour on her cheek, a badge of a war he hadn't even known was being fought. He thought of his own struggles, the late-night negotiations, the high-stakes mergers, the tactical maneuvers in air-conditioned skyscrapers. They felt like children's games compared to the raw, visceral survival she was describing. He had been building a world of numbers while she was literally kneading the bread of survival. "I could have called you," she said, finally meeting his gaze again, her eyes clear and uncompromising. "Every time a medical bill arrived, every time the flour prices spiked or the oven broke down, I thought about it. I knew that one phone call would solve every financial problem I had. But I also knew the price. I knew that the moment I took your money, you would own this child the same way you own your subsidiaries. You would see them as a successor, a piece of your carefully constructed success, rather than a human being. I chose the debt, Joon-seok. I chose the struggle. Because the debt was mine, and the child is mine. We weren't going to be another acquisition." The weight of her words settled into the silence of the bakery, more final than any legal judgment. Joon-seok looked at the folder in his hand, the foreclosure notice that represented his power, his reach, and his absolute failure. He realized that for the last 8 months, he had been the monster in her dark, the invisible hand tightening the noose around the only things that truly mattered. He had the power to save the bakery with a flick of his pen, but as he stood there, he realized that saving it with his wealth was exactly what she feared most. He wasn't the hero of this story, coming to the rescue with a checkbook. He was the enemy who had accidentally walked into the heart of the resistance. He looked at Joann, really seeing the strength in her tired frame, and for the first time in his life, Joon-seok felt small. He had the billions, but she had the life, the legacy, and the truth. And as he stood in the scent of yeast and scorched sugar, he realized that the bread of survival tasted far more like victory than any champagne he had ever poured. The vibration against Joon-seok's thigh was sudden and rhythmic, a haptic intrusion that felt like a needle pricking through the heavy atmosphere of the bakery. He didn't reach for it at first. He kept his eyes fixed on the smudge of flour on Joann's cheek, which now seemed like a mark of a war he had been waging against her without even knowing it. But the phone was relentless. It was the heartbeat of global insight, a device tethered to the nervous system of an empire that never slept, and it was demanding his attention with a cold, digital insistence. Through the storefront glass, he saw the silhouette of Secretary Choi step out of the black sedan. The assistant checked his watch, then peered through the window with a look of growing concern. To the outside world, Joon-seok was 10 minutes behind schedule, a delay that, in their world, could cost millions. His phone buzzed again, then again, a rapid-fire succession of notifications that spoke of a crisis in the Tokyo markets and an urgent query from the board regarding the very property he was standing in. Joann's gaze flickered to his pocket, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. It was a look of profound vindication. "Your world is calling, Joon-seok," she said, her voice sounding like a distant bell. "The raider has other cities to burn, other minor assets to liquidate. You should go. You're already late for your life." He finally pulled the phone from his pocket. The screen was a glowing mosaic of emergencies. A $400 million merger in Singapore was hitting a snag. A hostile move by a competitor was threatening their tech subsidiary. 3 high-priority, missed calls from the chairman. Each notification was a red-letter alert, a fire that only the great Joon-seok was supposed to be able to extinguish. In any other hour of his life, these messages would have triggered a surge of adrenaline, a sharp, focused hunger to dominate the chaos. But as he looked at the glowing screen, the text began to blur, the numbers and acronyms transforming into meaningless glyphs. He looked at the word liquidation, an illegal alert, and then looked at Joann, who was standing beside a rack of bread she had kneaded with her own hands. He looked at the risk assessment, notification, and then at the heartbeat he could almost see beneath her floral dress. The crises on his phone felt like ghosts, paper-thin echoes of a reality that had suddenly lost its color. He realized with a terrifying clarity that for 12 years, he had been treating the emergencies of a balance sheet as if they were matters of life and death, while treating the actual matters of life and death as if they were mere footnotes in a quarterly report. He had been a man who could see a market trend from a mile away, but was utterly blind to the fact that his own wife was drowning in his shadow. The phone buzzed again, a long, sustained vibration that signaled a direct call from the board. Joon-seok looked at the accept button, then at Secretary Choi, who was now tapping tentatively on the glass door. The world was demanding he return to his role, to the suit and the folder and the cold, efficient mask of the billionaire boss. "Is it a crisis?" Joann asked, her tone stripped of its edge, replaced by a weary curiosity. "No," Joon-seok said, his voice finally finding its weight. He looked at the device in his palm, the tool that had helped him build a kingdom and lose a home. "It's just noise." With a slow, deliberate motion, he didn't just silence the call. He pressed the power button, holding it until the screen flickered and then went dark, the glowing mosaic of corporate emergencies vanishing into a black mirror. The silence that followed was immediate and profound, a vacuum that filled with the humble sounds of the bakery, the crackle of cooling crusts and the rhythmic hum of the ovens. Outside, Secretary Choi froze, his eyes widening as he watched his boss tuck a dead phone back into his pocket. To the assistant, this was the ultimate catastrophe, an act of professional suicide. But to Joon-seok, it was the first moment of clarity he had experienced in a decade. He looked at Joann, and for the first time, He wasn't looking at her as a former spouse, or a designer, or a distressed debtor. He was looking at her as the person who held the only truth left in his life. He realized the real emergency wasn't the stock dip in Tokyo or the merger in Singapore. The emergency was the 8 months of silence. The emergency was the fact that he had almost signed a document that would have erased his child's first home just so he could be on time for a meeting that didn't matter. "I've been blind, Joann," he whispered, the leather folder still gripped in his other hand. "I thought I was building a vision of the world, but I was just perfecting a way to not see what I was losing. I'm not leaving. Let the board wait. Let the markets crash. I'm not leaving until I understand how to be the man who doesn't need that phone to know he's alive." Joann watched him, her hand still resting on her belly, her expression unreadable. But she didn't tell him to leave again. She simply stood there, in the scent of flour and scorched sugar, watching the billionaire boss realize that for all his power, he was the only one in the room who had absolutely nothing. The leather folder in Joon-seok's hand felt like a cold, heavy anchor, a relic of a man he no longer recognized. He looked at the signature line on the final foreclosure notice, the empty space that represented the end of Moore's traditions and the beginning of another sterile high-rise. For years, he had believed that his signature possessed a kind of divine power, capable of reshaping skylines and dictating the flow of global capital. Now, it just looked like a scar. He turned away from the counter, his polished Oxfords clicking a lonely rhythm against the worn tiles as he walked toward the glass door. Through the window, the black sedan sat idling, an expensive beast of shadow waiting to carry him back to his fortress of glass and steel. Secretary Choi was already there, his hand hovering near the door handle, his face a mask of professional anxiety. When Joon-seok pushed open the door, the cold city air rushed in, smelling of exhaust and winter, a sharp contrast to the yeasty warmth he was leaving behind. Secretary Choi stepped forward immediately, his tablet held like a shield. "Sir, the board is on standby," Choi whispered, his voice frantic. "The Singapore partners are demanding a status update, and the chairman has called 3 times. We need the signed deed. If we don't finalize the acquisition in the next 10 minutes, the entire development project faces illegal injunction." Joon-seok looked at his assistant, seeing for the first time the reflection of his own former self, a man who measured his worth by the speed of his responses and the ruthlessness of his efficiency. He looked at the high-rise buildings towering over the neighborhood, their mirrored surfaces reflecting a sky that looked like bruised steel. "The acquisition is over," Joon-seok said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced the hum of the idling engine. Choi froze, his eyes widening behind his spectacles. I don't understand, sir. The paperwork is complete. The funding is allocated. It's a minor asset, a routine liquidation." Joon-seok looked down at the leather folder. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached inside and pulled out the foreclosure notice. The paper was crisp, expensive, and carried the scent of a sterile office. He looked at the logo of Global Insight, a symbol he had once worn like a badge of honor. Then, he began to tear. The sound of the paper rending was small, yet in the quiet of the morning street, it sounded like a thunderclap. He tore the notice once, then again, and again, until the neatly contained transaction was nothing more than a handful of white confetti. He dropped the pieces, watching as the wind caught them, scattering the remnants of his corporate authority across the dirty pavement. "Sir," Choi gasped, stepping back as if Joon-seok had committed an act of madness. "What are you doing? This is a breach of fiduciary duty. The board will demand an explanation. They'll say you've lost your vision." Joon-seok looked at his assistant, a strange, sad smile touching his lips. "Tell the board that Moore's Traditions is no longer a distressed asset. Tell them that GI Capital is withdrawing the foreclosure effective immediately. And tell them that I finally found my vision." He took a step closer to Choi, his shadow falling over the black sedan. "For 12 years, I thought my job was to acquire everything I could see. I thought success was about expansion, about making the world smaller and more manageable. But I was wrong. Some things aren't assets to be managed. Some things are legacies to be honored. He gestured back toward the bakery, where Joann was visible through the glass, her hand still resting protectively over the life she was carrying. Some dreams shouldn't be acquired, Choi, Joon-seok said, his voice final. They should be left to grow. Go back to the office. Tell the chairman I'm taking a personal leave. And tell him that for the first time in a decade, I'm not late for anything. Without waiting for a response, Joon-seok turned his back on the sedan, the assistant, and the empire he had built. He walked back into the bakery, the bell chiming a soft welcome as he re-entered the world of flour and scorched sugar. He stood by the counter, his hands empty, looking at Joann with a raw, jagged hope that no amount of money could ever buy. The raider was gone, only the man remained. The bell above the door chimed with a soft, melodic finality as Joon-seok stepped back into the bakery. The frantic energy of the morning rush had begun to ebb, leaving behind a quiet that felt heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. Joann stood behind the counter, her hands still resting on the curve of her belly, her eyes tracking the movement of the white paper fragments swirling like snow on the sidewalk outside. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. The empty leather folder in his hand and the missing black sedan told the story of a man who had finally decided to stop running. There is a park 3 blocks from here, Joann said quietly, her voice devoid of the sharp armor she had worn all morning. It isn't impressive. The benches are peeling and the playground equipment is old. But it's quiet, and the air doesn't smell like debt. Joon-seok nodded, unable to find his voice. He waited as she untied her flour-stained apron, revealing the full, beautiful reality of the life she was carrying. As they walked out together, the billionaire CEO and the woman who had built a fortress out of sourdough, the neighborhood seemed to change. To Joon-seok, the high-rises no longer looked like monuments to progress. They looked like shadows. The park was exactly as she had described, a small, humble square of green carved out between towering apartment blocks. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. I'm not asking to buy my way back in, Joann. I know you don't want my billions, and I know you don't need my help to survive. You've proven that. But I'm asking for a second chance. Not to be the CEO of your life, but to be the man who learns how to see again. Joann finally turned to meet his gaze. The steel in her eyes was still there, but it was tempered by a raw, jagged vulnerability. What does that mean, Joon-seok? You can't just turn off the empire. You can't just stop being the man the board of directors expects you to be. I tore up the contract, he reminded her, a small, sad smile touching his lips. I told Choi I was taking leave. For the first time in my life, I don't care what the chairman thinks. I want to redefine what matters. I want to know the daughter, or the son, I almost erased because I was too busy checking the Tokyo markets. I want to sit in this park and not check my phone. I want to earn the right to be the person you share a cold cup of tea with. He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them, a silent request for permission. After a long moment, Joann shifted, her shoulder brushing against his. She didn't take his hand, but she didn't move away. It won't be like a merger, she warned, her voice softening. You can't negotiate the terms later. Children aren't projects you can start and stop when the next quarterly report is due. They need the man who stays, not the billionaire who visits. I'm not the same person I was in May, Joon-seok said, and for the first time, he believed it. I don't want to expand anymore. I just want to be here, right here, in the cold, on a peeling bench, with you. The silence that followed was no longer brittle. It was a space of possibility. Joann looked down at her belly, then back at the man who had traded his suit for a smudge of flour and a torn contract. She didn't offer him forgiveness, not yet. That was a debt that would take a lifetime to settle. But she left the door slightly ajar. The bakery needs the floor mopped every evening, she said, a flicker of the old Joann, the one who challenged his serious expressions, returning to her voice. And the sacks of grain are too heavy for me to lift now. Joon-seok felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in a decade. It wasn't the adrenaline of a win. It was the quiet, steady warmth of a beginning. I'll start tonight, he promised. No phones, no folders, just the grain and the floor. As they sat together in the fading afternoon light, the billionaire, and the baker, the world continued its relentless expansion around them. But in that small park, time had finally slowed down enough for a man to see what he had been missing all along. True wealth wasn't measured in the height of the high-rise, but in the courage to sit in the wreckage and ask for a second chance. The evening sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the city's skyscrapers, casting long, amber shadows through the storefront of Moore's Traditions. Inside, the air had cooled, the frantic heat of the ovens replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness. Joon-seok stood in the center of the room, a man who had spent his life commanding boardrooms, now standing awkwardly amidst the tools of a trade he didn't understand. He had removed his charcoal blazer, draping it over a flour-dusted stool, and rolled the sleeves of his crisp, white shirt to his elbows. The silk tie, a symbol of his corporate armor, was loosened and tucked into his pocket. Joann watched him from near the back of the shop, her hand resting on the small of her back as she leaned against the cooling racks. She didn't offer a greeting or a command. She simply waited to see if the billionaire who had promised to mop the floors would actually reach for the bucket. Joon-seok found the mop in a narrow closet near the kitchen. It was heavy, the wooden handle worn smooth by years of use, smelling of lemon oil and old water. As he filled the bucket from the industrial sink, the sound of the rushing water was the only noise in the shop. His phone, the device that had once dictated the rhythm of his heart, remained dark and silent in his blazer pocket. In the high-rise offices across the city, the board members were likely still reeling, and Secretary Choi was surely drafting a dozen different explanations for his boss's sudden disappearance. But to Joon-seok, those people felt like characters in a book he had finally finished reading. He began at the back, dragging the wet mop across the cracked tiles. The physical labor was a shock to a body accustomed to ergonomic chairs and climate-controlled cars. His back ached almost immediately, and the scent of the cleaning solution stung his nose, yet there was a profound, grounding clarity in the work. Each stroke of the mop erased a smudge of flour, a footprint, a memory of the day's struggle. He wasn't optimizing a process or managing an acquisition. He was simply making a floor clean for the woman he had almost lost. "You're missing the corners," Joann said softly, her voice carrying a trace of the old, playful challenge he hadn't heard in years. Joon-seok looked up, a bead of sweat tracing a path through the faint dust on his forehead. He didn't offer a clever retort. Instead, he adjusted his grip and carefully pushed the mop into the shadows of the display case. "I'm learning," he replied, and for the first time, the statement wasn't a corporate platitude. It was the truth. As the moon rose, silvering the windows, Joon-seok moved to the sacks of grain. They were heavy, 50-pound weights of burlap and potential. He hauled them from the delivery area to the storage bins, the rough fabric scratching his expensive dress slacks and staining his white sleeves with dust. With each sack he lifted, he felt the weight of the 8 months he had been absent. This was the weight she had been carrying alone. This was the physical toll of the debt he had overseen from his glass tower. He moved the final sack into place and leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. He looked at his hands. The fingernails were no longer perfectly manicured. They were tipped with white dust and grimy from the grain. He looked at the shop, which now gleamed under the soft hum of the night lights. It wasn't the quiet opulence of a jewelry boutique or the sterile perfection of a penthouse. It was a place where life happened, where bread was made, and where a family legacy had been saved by a handful of torn paper. Joann approached him slowly, her movements deliberate. She stopped just a foot away, the space between them no longer a canyon of silence, but a bridge of shared exhaustion. She reached out, her fingers hesitating before she gently brushed a streak of flour from his cheek. The touch was light, but to Joon-seok, it felt more significant than any contract he had ever signed. "The chairman will be looking for you tomorrow," she whispered. "Let him look," Joon-seok said, his gaze fixed on her. "I'm not an asset to be managed anymore, Joann. And neither are you. I spent 12 years trying to be someone worth seeing, but I forgot that the only eyes that mattered were the ones I stopped looking into." He looked down at her belly, at the life that was now the only milestone he cared to reach. He realized that true wealth wasn't measured in the zeros of his bank account or the number of buildings that bore his name. It was measured in the heat of a bakery, the ache of a day's honest work, and the courage to turn off the world so he could finally hear a heartbeat. "I don't have a plan for tomorrow," he admitted, a statement that would have once terrified him. "I don't have a strategy or a 5-year projection. I just have tonight, and a floor that needs to stay clean." Joann didn't offer him a grand promise of forgiveness, but she didn't step away. She moved closer, allowing him to rest his hand, his dusty, tired hand, over the curve of her stomach. Beneath the floral fabric, he felt a small, sudden movement. A kick. A greeting. A beginning. Joon-seok, the billionaire who had once closing billion-dollar deals without flinching, felt his eyes sting with a raw, jagged heat. He had spent his life acquiring things he didn't need, only to realize that the most precious thing he owned was a second chance he hadn't yet earned, but was finally ready to work for. As the city continued its relentless, noisy expansion outside, the billionaire boss stayed in the quiet of the bakery, finally understanding that he wasn't late for his life. He had just finally arrived.